The January wind howled through cracks in the workshop window, carrying ice that stung like needles. Calvin's fingers, stiff with arthritis and cold, worked the sandpaper across the unfinished eagle's wing. The wood grain caught against the paper with a soft whisper that barely rose above the heater's struggling rattle. His workshop smelled of pine shavings and linseed oil, familiar comforts against Montana's deep winter. He paused when he heard the Mercedes pull into the driveway, Maggie returning from her charity committee. The tires crunched over frozen gravel. His wedding band caught the weak light as he set down his tools, dusted sawdust from his flannel shirt, and headed toward the house. Through the cracked kitchen door, Maggie's laughter cut sharper than his carving tools. Honestly, Richard, his presence bothers me. I wish he would disappear forever. Then the house, the accounts, everything would be ours. Calvin's chest tightened. 40 years at the bank, yet he'd missed the signs of his own financial execution. Maybe it was time to become the ghost she wished for. Calvin stood motionless in the hallway, his hand still gripping the brass doorknob. The metal felt cold against his palm, its chill seeping into his bones like the words he'd just heard. Inside the kitchen, Maggie's voice dropped to a whisper, but the urgent, excited tone carried through the crack in the door. I know, she murmured. The papers are nearly ready. Yes, Richard, I can handle him. He trusts me completely. The floor creaked beneath Calvin's weight as he shifted. He froze, but Maggie's conversation continued uninterrupted. He spends all day in that dusty workshop now, carving little animals like some retiree cliché. Her laugh tinkled like breaking glass. Doesn't even notice what's happening right under his nose. Calvin stepped back, each movement deliberate, silent. The scent of Maggie's expensive perfume, the one he'd given her for Christmas, drifted from the kitchen, now sickly sweet and cloying. He retreated to his workshop, the sanctuary he'd built after retiring from First National Bank of Oak Ridge after 43 years. The door closed behind him with a soft click. His hands trembled as he picked up the framed photograph from his workbench, their wedding day, May 1982. Maggie smiling up at him, his arm around her waist. He'd been the youngest branch manager in the bank's history. She'd been the most beautiful woman he'd ever seen. The glass was dusty. He wiped it with his thumb, leaving a smudge. The workshop heater clicked and groaned as it fought against the Montana winter. Outside, the wind whistled through the pine trees, their branches heavy with snow. Calvin set the photograph face down and lowered himself onto his stool, the wood creaking beneath his weight. 5 years into retirement, and now this. The words replayed in his mind. His presence bothers me. I wish he would disappear forever. Calvin rubbed his hands together, feeling the calluses that had formed since he'd taken up woodworking. Different from the smooth hands of his banking days. He picked up the half-carved eagle, its wings still rough and unfinished, its eyes not yet defined. He'd started it 3 months ago, the most ambitious piece he'd attempted. 40 years, he whispered to the empty room, the sound absorbed by sawdust and wood shavings. 40 years of marriage, and now he knew exactly what he was worth to her. The next morning, Calvin rose before dawn, as was his habit. He dressed quietly, leaving Maggie sleeping in their bed. Her breathing was deep and even, her face peaceful in repose. No sign of the betrayal he'd discovered. He made coffee and carried the steaming mug to his desk in the study, the familiar ritual unchanged despite everything. The furnace hummed beneath the floorboards, pushing warm air through the vents. Outside, snow fell in fat, lazy flakes, adding to the 3 feet already on the ground. Calvin pulled open the bottom drawer where he kept their financial documents. Tax season was approaching, and he'd always handled their finances. His fingers brushed against the cool metal of the file cabinet, methodically organized as only a career banker could manage. Behind him, the clock ticked steadily, marking time in the quiet house. He flipped through the folders, insurance policies, investment statements, property tax records. His movement slowed as he found a folder he didn't recognize. Inside were mortgage refinance papers for their home, papers he had never seen, with his signature on the dotted line. A signature that wasn't his. Calvin's fingers traced the forgery. It was close. Someone who didn't know his handwriting might be fooled, but the loops were wrong, the pressure too light. In his 4 decades at the bank, he'd spotted enough forgeries to recognize one now. The papers rustled as his hands began to shake. The coffee cooled, forgotten, as he examined the document. Their home of 35 years was being remortgaged without his knowledge, the equity to be withdrawn in a lump sum. The paper smelled of fresh ink and deception. Calvin checked the date. The closing was scheduled for February 15th. 30 days away. The papers mentioned a development company as co-applicant, Donnelly Properties, LLC. Richard Donnelly, the man on the phone with his wife. Calvin carefully returned the papers to their folder, slid it back in place, and closed the drawer. The lock clicked softly as he turned the key. He had 30 days to decide, confront or counter. The Oak Ridge Country Club's Winter Gala transformed the normally austere clubhouse into a glittering wonderland. Crystal chandeliers reflected off silver decorations, and white linen tablecloths gleamed under carefully arranged centerpieces. The band played soft jazz that floated above the murmur of conversation and the clink of champagne glasses. Calvin adjusted his tie, the silk uncomfortable against his neck after years of retirement. His tuxedo, rarely worn now, felt tight across his shoulders. He scanned the room, nodding to familiar faces, people he'd approved mortgages for, helped secure business loans, advised on retirement plans during his decades at First National. Across the room, Maggie laughed, radiant in a new blue dress he didn't recognize. Her hand rested on Richard Donnelly's arm, her red nails bright against his black sleeve. Richard leaned close to her ear, whispering something that made her throw back her head in delight. "Beautiful event, isn't it?" Peterson's wife appeared at Calvin's side, her perfume mingling with the scent of warming hors d'oeuvres being carried through the crowd. "Yes, indeed," Calvin replied, taking a sip of his scotch. The liquid burned pleasantly down his throat. "Maggie did a wonderful job on the decorating committee," she continued. "Though I imagine Richard Donnelly's donation helped. Have you met him? Quite the rising star in development. They say he's planning something big for the lakefront." Calvin nodded, his face neutral despite the churning in his stomach. "We've been introduced." A waiter approached with a tray of canapes. The smell of smoked salmon momentarily distracted Calvin, but his appetite had vanished. "You must be so proud of Maggie," Mrs. Peterson continued, oblivious to his discomfort. "She's been spending so much time on community projects lately. The two of them have really revitalized the fundraising committee." The two of them, not the slip of someone who thought they were being discreet. "Excuse me," Calvin murmured. "I see someone I need to speak with." He moved through the crowd, stopping occasionally when necessary, exchanging pleasantries while keeping Maggie and Richard in his peripheral vision. Their body language spoke volumes. The casual touches, the leaning in, the private smiles. Calvin approached the bar, ordered another scotch, and felt a hand on his shoulder. "Calvin, how are you enjoying retirement?" Bob Williams, the current manager at First National, clapped him on the back. "Finding ways to stay busy," Calvin replied, his voice steady despite the hollowness in his chest. "Woodworking, mostly. Heard you're quite good. Maggie showed us photos of your carvings at the last committee meeting." Bob lowered his voice. "Speaking of Maggie, what's the story with her and Donnelly? They seem friendly." The music swelled as Calvin contemplated his response. From across the room, he caught Eliza Kemp's eye, his former assistant, now a loan officer. Her concerned glance told him that Bob wasn't the only one who had noticed. The shame burned through him, hotter than the scotch. The bank lobby hadn't changed much since Calvin's retirement. The same marble counters, the same oil paintings of Montana landscapes, the same hushed atmosphere of financial propriety. His shoes squeaked slightly against the polished floor as he approached the teller window. The air smelled of paper, ink, and the lemon polish used on the wooden desks. "Mr. Mercer, good to see you," the young teller smiled. Jenny, if he remembered correctly. "What can I help you with today?" "I'd like to check my accounts, please," Calvin said, sliding his ID across the counter. "All of them." "Of course." Her fingers tapped efficiently on the keyboard. The printer hummed and whirred, producing statements that she handed to him with a professional smile. Calvin scanned the documents, his banker's eye moving methodically down the columns of numbers. Everything seemed in order until he reached their retirement accounts. There were pending withdrawal requests, large ones, that he had never authorized. "Is Eliza available?" he asked, keeping his voice level. 5 minutes later, he sat in Eliza's office. The door closed behind them. The radiator hissed softly in the corner. "These withdrawal requests." Calvin tapped the paper with his index finger. "I didn't make them." Eliza's face was professionally composed, but her eyes showed concern. "I had questions about those myself. The signatures didn't quite match our records, but—" She hesitated. "But they came from my home computer," Calvin finished for her, "from my email address." She nodded. "We placed a temporary hold, following protocol for unusual activity, but Calvin—" She leaned forward, lowering her voice. "To formally stop this, we'd need to file a fraud report." "Against my wife?" he said flatly. "Yes." Eliza's perfume, subtle, floral, reminded him of spring, incongruous in the dead of winter. And given Montana's laws, that would potentially trigger an investigation that could impact both your reputations, your financial standings, everything. Calvin stared at the statements. Years of careful saving, of planning for a comfortable retirement, nearly undone with a few forged signatures. What are my options? Without a fraud report? Limited? Eliza's fingers drummed once on her desk. I can maintain the temporary hold for suspicious activity, but that's a short-term solution. Eventually, we'd need documentation. The clock on her wall ticked loudly, marking seconds that felt like hours. There is one other thing, she added. As your former employer, the bank takes elder financial exploitation very seriously. Calvin stiffened. I'm not being exploited, Eliza. I'm being betrayed. There's a difference. She nodded, apologetic. Of course. I just meant we have protocols that might help, but they all require making this public, Calvin finished, understanding the trap. Filing reports, possibly involving authorities. The realization settled over him like a heavy blanket. He couldn't file against Maggie without destroying both their reputations, which was exactly what she was counting on. Ice groaned and shifted beneath their boots as Calvin and Sam trudged across Heron Lake's frozen surface. The February morning was bright but bitterly cold, their breath forming clouds that hung in the still air. Calvin's fishing gear jangled softly with each step, the sound amplified in the winter silence. Nothing clears the head like ice fishing, Sam Turner declared, his voice gruff from decades of early mornings and strong coffee. At 72, the retired lawyer moved with the deliberate certainty of a man who had spent his life being precise. No distractions, just you, the ice, and whatever's swimming below. They reached Sam's favorite spot, where the lake deepened near an underwater ridge. The auger bit into the ice with a harsh grinding sound, shavings piling up around Calvin's boots. The smell of cold, clean water rose from the widening hole. Heard about Donnelly's development plans? Sam asked casually, setting up his folding stool. Ambitious project. Condos, marina, the works. Calvin nodded, focusing on baiting his hook. Seems to be moving fast. Too fast, if you ask me. Sam poured coffee from his thermos, the steam rising between them. Man's buying up every available parcel around the lake, throwing money around, making big promises. Calvin lowered his line into the dark water. Maggie's impressed with him. Sam's eyes, sharp despite his age, studied Calvin's face. Noticed that at the gala. Wasn't sure if I should mention it. A comfortable silence fell between them, the kind only possible after 40 years of friendship. Below the ice, fish moved in the cold depths, invisible but present. Remember your grandfather's place? Why, yeah, Sam asked suddenly. That cabin on the northeast shore? Calvin looked up, surprised by the change in topic. Been years since I thought about it. Hasn't been used since he passed. Still own it? Far as I know. Never did anything with it after the funeral. Sam nodded thoughtfully, sipping his coffee. The bitter aroma mixed with the crisp winter air. Might be worth checking the deed. Property like that, lakefront, historical exemption under the old statutes, could be valuable, especially with developers circling. Calvin frowned, memory stirring. Think the paperwork's still in the attic. Granddad left everything to me, but I never bothered transferring the deed. Never seemed important. Common law abandonment's tricky in Montana, Sam said, his lawyer's mind still sharp. Without formal abandonment, the property should still be yours, separate from marital assets. Might be worth digging out those papers. A fish tugged at Calvin's line, the rod tip bouncing gently. He set the hook with a practiced flick of his wrist. Just saying, Sam continued, watching Calvin reel in a decent-sized trout, its scales gleaming silver against the white ice. Some things are worth holding on to, especially when others might be looking to take them. The fish flopped on the ice, its gills working frantically. Calvin dispatched it quickly, mercifully, with a practiced hand. If the cabin deed was still in the attic, it might be his only card left to play. First National's West Side branch was smaller than the main building downtown, tucked between a pharmacy and a coffee shop in a newer development. Calvin had never used this location during his working years, which was precisely why he'd chosen it today. The lobby smelled of new carpet and fresh paint. A television mounted in the corner murmured financial news, the sound blending with the soft classical music playing through overhead speakers. Calvin approached a teller he didn't recognize, a young woman with an eager smile, Her nameplate read Bethany. "Good afternoon," he said, sliding his ID across the counter. "I'd like to open a new checking account, please. Individual, not joint." "Of course, Mr. Mercer." Her fingers clicked efficiently over the keyboard. "Will you be transferring funds from another account today?" "Yes." He handed her a cashier's check. "This is from an inheritance account at Montana Credit Union. I'd like to deposit it here." It wasn't a lie. It wasn't, his father had left him a modest sum which he'd kept separate over the years. Not significant compared to what he and Maggie had accumulated together, but enough for what he needed now. "And I'd like to request a safe deposit box as well," he added. 20 minutes later, Calvin walked out with a new checkbook, ATM card, and a small key. The first pieces of a life separate from Maggie's, established quietly, without confrontation. He drove to the county records office next, where he requested copies of his grandfather's property documents. The clerk, a middle-aged woman with reading glasses on a beaded chain, pulled the records efficiently. "Mercer, northeast shore of Heron Lake," she muttered, fingertips dancing across her computer keyboard. The printer whirred and clicked behind her. "Here we are. Original deed from 1947, transferred to Calvin J. Mercer in 1998. Never updated since then, but still active in your name." "Has anyone else requested these records recently?" Calvin asked, trying to sound casual. She checked the system, frowning slightly. "Yes, actually. Donnelly Properties made an inquiry last month. Standard procedure for developers, checking adjacent properties." Calvin nodded, accepting the papers she handed him. The official seal of Oak Ridge County caught the fluorescent light, embossed and authoritative. "Thank you," he said, carefully placing the documents in his briefcase. The building's heavy doors swung shut behind him, sealing out the winter cold. In his pocket, the new bank cards felt like small rectangles of possibility, invisible first steps toward his disappearance. Margaret's laughter carried across the produce section of Wilson's Market, her voice pitched to carry just enough to be overheard. Calvin paused by the apples, his shopping basket hanging from his arm as he listened. "It's getting worse," she was saying to Helen Bradshaw, the pharmacist's wife. "Found him in the garage yesterday, staring at his tools like he couldn't remember what they were for." The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. The sweet smell of overripe bananas mingled with the earthy scent of potatoes and onions. "Poor thing," Helen's voice dripped with practiced sympathy. "My uncle was the same way before they moved him to Shady Pines. Started small, forgetting keys, missing appointments. Then one day he tried to make coffee with laundry detergent." "That's exactly what I'm afraid of," Maggie sighed. "Richard's been so helpful, looking into options. But Calvin's so stubborn. Won't admit anything's wrong." Calvin's fingers tightened around an apple, the waxy skin smooth against his palm. "Men of that generation," Helen clucked. "Too proud to accept help." "Especially with finances," Maggie added. "I'm worried about what could happen if he keeps managing our accounts. Richard suggested getting power of attorney, just as a precaution." The apple bruised under Calvin's grip. He placed it back in the display and moved around the corner, the wheels of his cart squeaking slightly against the linoleum floor. Maggie startled when she saw him, recovery flashing across her face. "Calvin, there you are. I was just telling Helen about the beautiful eagle you're carving." "Was that before or after discussing my mental deterioration?" His voice remained calm, but several shoppers glanced their way. Helen mumbled something about needing to pick up milk and hurried away, her cart rattling. "Don't be ridiculous," Maggie said, her smile tight. "We're concerned, that's all. You've been so distant lately, spending all day in that workshop." "Funny," Calvin replied, selecting a bunch of bananas and placing them carefully in his cart. "My hands remember exactly what to do with tools. Same hands that built our retirement accounts. Same mind that managed the bank for 20 years. Maggie's eyes narrowed slightly. "No one's questioning your past accomplishments, dear. It's the present that concerns us." "Us. Not you. Us." "I may be retired," Calvin said softly, "but I'm not confused, and I'm not blind." He turned his cart toward the checkout, leaving Maggie standing beside a pyramid of oranges, her carefully constructed narrative momentarily shaken. The same hands she claimed couldn't remember where he put his keys had built their entire financial foundation. The Oak Ridge Community Center hummed with conversation as Calvin found a seat near the back of the room. Metal folding chairs scraped against the floor as latecomers arrived, shaking snow from their coats. The radiators clanked and hissed along the walls, struggling to warm the high-ceilinged space. The room smelled of wet wool and coffee from the urn set up on a side table. At the front, a projection screen displayed Heron Lake Vista, a new vision for Oak Ridge, the title superimposed over a digital rendering of modern condominiums nestled against pine trees. Richard Donnelly stood at the podium, immaculate in a tailored suit that set him apart from the flannel and denim of most attendees. His confident smile flashed as he gestured toward the screen. Phase 1 will include 40 luxury units, a private marina, and a clubhouse, he announced. We're prioritizing environmental considerations while maximizing the spectacular views that make Heron Lake special. Calvin scanned the crowd. Maggie sat in the front row, nodding approvingly. Several town council members flanked her, their expressions interested but cautious. The economic benefits can't be overstated, Richard continued, advancing to a slide filled with projected numbers. Construction jobs, increased property values, tourism dollars. Heron Lake Vista will revitalize our community. A hand raised in the middle row. What about road access? That shore's only got one county road in. Richard's smile never faltered. Excellent question. We've been working with county planning on a new access route. He clicked to the next slide, showing a map with a red line cutting through what Calvin instantly recognized as his grandfather's property. This proposed scenic drive would connect directly to Highway 23, avoiding town traffic entirely. Richard's laser pointer traced the path. We're in discussions with all affected property owners, offering generous compensation packages. Calvin's jaw tightened. He hadn't received any offers or discussions because they weren't planning to ask. Another hand rose. What's the timeline look like? We're hoping to break ground this spring, Richard replied. The necessary permits are being processed, financing is secured, and most land acquisitions are complete. He glanced at Maggie, a private look of triumph passing between them. Our team at Donnelly Properties believes in moving efficiently once a vision is clear. And this vision, he gestured to a sweeping aerial view of the development, will transform Oak Ridge for generations to come. The mayor stood, applauding, and others joined. Maggie beamed from the front row, every inch the supportive community leader. Calvin remained seated, hands resting on his knees. The pieces clicked into place with terrible clarity. The refinanced house, the drained retirement accounts, the mental competency rumors, all leading to this moment. A development that required his grandfather's land they thought would be easy to acquire from a confused old man whose wife controlled the finances. It wasn't just their marriage they wanted to erase, it was his entire legacy. The attic air hung thick with dust that danced in the beam of Calvin's flashlight. The floorboards creaked beneath his weight as he navigated around stacked boxes and forgotten furniture. February wind rattled the dormer windows, driving occasional bursts of snow against the glass. His breath fogged in the cold as he approached the old steamer trunk pushed against the back wall. The brass latches were dull with age but opened smoothly at his touch, releasing the musty scent of old paper and memories. Calvin knelt beside the trunk, his joints protesting. Inside, organized with the precision that had defined his banking career, were labeled folders of family documents, birth certificates, death certificates, insurance policies long exhausted. His fingers, stiff in the cold, methodically sorted through the papers until he found what he sought, a thick manila envelope marked Lake Property. The deed was there, the paper yellowed but intact, his grandfather's spidery signature clear at the bottom. Alongside it was the transfer document from 1998, when Ezra Mercer had signed over the property to his only grandson. Calvin spread the papers on top of a nearby crate, angling his flashlight for better visibility. The property description matched what he remembered. 3 acres of lakefront land, including a 2-bedroom cabin and detached workshop. The deed bore the stamp of the county recorder's office and his own signature, accepting ownership. What caught his eye, however, was what wasn't there. No mention of Maggie, no transfer into joint ownership. In the years after inheriting the property, he'd simply paid the modest taxes and let the cabin stand empty, a placeholder for memories rather than an active part of their lives. A mouse skittered across the attic floor, its tiny nails clicking against the wood. Outside, the snowfall intensified, a soft, shushing sound against the roof. Calvin carefully returned the documents to their envelope, adding it to the small pile of papers he'd set aside. Evidence of a life before Maggie, pieces of himself that had somehow remained separate from their marriage, protected, unknowingly, by his own inattention. He descended the attic stairs, the envelope secure in his hand, a plan forming with each step. The county clerk's office hummed with fluorescent lights and the steady rhythm of rubber stamps meeting paper. A wall clock ticked loudly above filing cabinets, marking the passing minutes of bureaucratic procedure. The room smelled of ink, paper, and the coffee that stained the clerk's mug. Calvin waited patiently at the counter while the clerk, her nameplate read Mrs. Shirley Hoffman, examined his grandfather's deed and the subsequent transfer documents. "Everything appears in order, Mr. Mercer," she said, peering at him over reading glasses. "The property has remained solely in your name since the 1998 transfer. Property taxes are current through this year." She shuffled the papers, stapling relevant forms. "You mentioned wanting to verify the current status?" "Yes," Calvin replied, "and to ensure there have been no claims or encumbrances filed against it." Her fingers tapped efficiently on her keyboard. "No claims on record. The property is clear, though I do see a notification request was filed last month." "Notification request?" "Yes. When someone is interested in a property, they can file to be notified of any status changes." She adjusted her glasses. "In this case, Donnelly Properties requested notification of any ownership changes, tax delinquencies, or permit applications." Calvin nodded, unsurprised. "I'd like to file a formal statement of continued ownership, please, and update the contact information for the property." "Of course." She pulled forms from a drawer, sliding them across the counter. "You'll want the affirmation of ownership intent. It's not strictly necessary, but it does formally establish your active interest in the property. Prevents any presumption of abandonment." Calvin completed the forms carefully, his banker's penmanship precise and clear. When finished, he slid them back to Mrs. Hoffman, who examined them briefly before applying her notary stamp with a satisfying thunk. "Is there anything else you need today, Mr. Mercer?" Calvin considered the question. "I'd like information about transferring the property into a trust, actually, to protect it long term." She brightened, clearly pleased by his forethought. "Smart move. We have several options for that." She reached beneath the counter and produced another set of forms. "This packet explains the basics. If you decide to proceed, you'd need to consult with an attorney to establish the trust, then return here to record the transfer." "Thank you," Calvin said, accepting the packet. "One last thing," Mrs. Hoffman added, lowering her voice slightly. "Given the development interest in that area, you might want to be cautious about any unsolicited offers. Property values around Heron Lake are fluid right now." Calvin nodded his thanks, gathering his papers. The clerk's warning was unnecessary, but her concerns seemed genuine. One longtime Oak Ridge resident looking out for another. The forms felt substantial in his hands as he walked to his truck. The clerk had confirmed what Calvin suspected. The land had never been added to their marital assets. The road to Heron Lake narrowed as it curved through pine forest, patches of ice gleaming in the afternoon sun. Calvin's truck bounced over ruts frozen in place since December, the suspension groaning in protest. Beside him, Sam Turner braced himself against the dashboard, his fishing gear rattling in the truck bed behind them. "Been years since I've been out this way," Sam commented as they approached the lake's northeast shore. "Your grandfather sure knew how to pick a spot." They rounded a final bend, and the cabin came into view, its weathered logs darkened by decades of Montana winters. The roof sagged slightly under its burden of snow. A stone chimney rose from the center, the hearth that had once warmed 3 generations of Mercer's cold for nearly 20 years. Calvin parked in what had once been a clearing, now reclaimed by saplings and brush. The truck doors slammed with metallic finality, the sound echoing across the frozen lake. "Looks solid from here," Sam observed, trudging through knee-deep snow toward the cabin. His breath plumed in the cold air. "Logs are tight. Foundation seems good." Calvin nodded, fishing the old iron key from his pocket. The lock protested but yielded, and the door swung inward with a groan of rusted hinges. Inside, dust motes danced in the shafts of light streaming through dirty windows. The furniture remained where it had been left: a sagging couch, a wooden table with 4 chairs, a cast-iron stove in the corner. The air smelled of dust, mouse droppings, and the lingering ghost of wood smoke from fires long extinguished. Sam whistled softly. "Better shape than I expected. Good bones." Calvin moved through the cabin, memories surfacing with each step. Summers learning to fish with his grandfather, winters huddled by the fire, listening to stories of frontier days and bank runs, the workshop out back where he'd first learned to carve wood, watching old hands guide young ones. He pushed open the back door, stepping onto a small porch overlooking the lake. Despite years of neglect, the view remained spectacular. The frozen expanse of Heron Lake stretching toward distant mountains, the late afternoon sun turning everything golden. The workshop stood 20 yards away, its door hanging askew from one hinge. Calvin made his way through the snow, Sam following behind. Inside, Cobwebs draped the corners, but his grandfather's workbench remained, tools still hanging on their pegs. Calvin ran his hand across the surface, dust revealing the same rich wood grain as his unfinished eagle, both waiting to be restored. The Wednesday morning service at First Methodist had just concluded, parishioners gathering in the social hall for coffee and conversation. The aroma of cheap coffee and store-bought cookies filled the wood-paneled room. Radiators hissed along the walls, finally warming after the long service in the drafty sanctuary. Calvin stood near the refreshment table, balancing a styrofoam cup in one hand while nodding at Pastor Mitchell's comments about the unseasonably cold March. Their breath still fogged slightly in the chilly room. "Calvin, we've missed you at choir practice." Mrs. Jenkins appeared at his elbow, her flowered perfume cutting through the coffee smell. "Are you feeling better?" Before he could respond, a ripple in the crowd caught his attention. Maggie had entered the social hall, elegant in a camel-colored coat that must have cost a month of his pension. A small cluster of women immediately surrounded her, heads bent in conversation. "Just so worried about him." Maggie's voice carried just enough to reach Calvin's ears. "The doctor says it's not uncommon at his age." "Such a shame," someone murmured. "He always seems so sharp." "It's the quiet ones you need to watch," another voice added. "My brother-in-law was the same way. Fine 1 minute, then suddenly couldn't remember his own children." Calvin's cup crumpled slightly in his grip, coffee sloshing dangerously close to the rim. Pastor Mitchell's eyes followed Calvin's gaze, understanding dawning in his weathered face. "Perception becomes reality when repeated often enough," the pastor said quietly, for Calvin's ears alone. "Even the strongest tree can be felled by persistent boring beetles." Across the room, Maggie dabbed at her eye, a perfectly timed gesture of distress. "We're looking into options. Richard's been such a support, helping navigate all the legal complexities." "That handsome developer?" Mrs. Peterson asked. "Such a blessing he's taken an interest in our community." "Yes," Maggie smiled, vulnerability and strength perfectly balanced. "In our community and, well, these things happen gradually. Calvin has good days, of course, but you understand why I've had to step in with our finances. Richard's been advising me on protecting our assets given the circumstances." The circle of women nodded sympathetically, their expressions holding the particular blend of concern and fascination that accompanied others' misfortunes. Calvin felt a hand on his shoulder. Sam Turner had arrived, his presence solid and reassuring. "Come on," Sam muttered. "Let's get some air." Outside, the March sun struggled to warm the church steps. Calvin's breath plumed in the cold as he leaned against the stone railing. "She's been doing this for weeks," he said finally. "Little comments, concerned glances, at the bank, the grocery store, even called my doctor." Sam nodded, his face grim, building a narrative, groundwork for what comes next. "Power of attorney," Calvin confirmed. "If enough people believe I'm slipping, she won't need my signature at all." The church door opened behind them, parishioners beginning to emerge. Among them, Maggie descended the steps, accepting sympathetic pats on her arm, the perfect picture of a concerned wife facing difficult times with grace, like every whispered word was another nail in the coffin she was building for him. The cabin smelled different now, sawdust and fresh paint gradually replacing must and decay. March sunlight streamed through newly cleaned windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the warming air. Outside, the lake ice had begun to soften at the edges, dark patches appearing where the spring thaw had begun. Calvin moved methodically through the main room, measuring and noting dimensions on a small notepad. The floorboards creaked beneath his weight, solid despite years of neglect. The sound of a vehicle approaching drew him to the window. A sleek black SUV pulled into the clearing, tires crunching on the mixture of snow and emerging gravel. Calvin recognized Richard Donnelly's vehicle immediately. He stepped onto the porch as Richard emerged, looking oddly out of place in his camel hair coat and Italian loafers. "Mr. Mercer," Richard called, feigning surprise. "I didn't expect to find anyone here." "It's my property," Calvin replied evenly. "Why wouldn't I be here?" Richard approached, carefully navigating the muddy patches. "Maggie mentioned this old place, but I understood it had been abandoned for years." His smile didn't reach his eyes. "I'm surveying properties around the lake. Professional interest." "I'm aware of your interest," Calvin said. "Saw your presentation at the community center." Richard glanced at the cabin, taking in the new window glass and repaired porch steps. "Doing some renovations? Didn't take you for the handyman type? There's a lot you don't know about me, Mr. Donnelly. Richard's smile tightened. Look, I'll be direct. This property is crucial for the Lake Development's access road. I'm prepared to make a very generous offer. Calvin leaned against the porch railing. Not interested in selling. You should discuss it with Maggie before making decisions, Richard said, his tone shifting slightly. She has a broader perspective on your financial situation. Well, my financial situation, Calvin repeated, emphasizing the pronoun. And what perspective would that be? Before Richard could answer, another vehicle approached, an old station wagon that parked beside Richard's SUV. Leonard Harris, the area's most respected art dealer, emerged, waving cheerfully. Right on time, Mr. Mercer, Leonard called, retrieving a leather case from his passenger seat. Sorry I'm a few minutes late. The North Road is still half mud. Calvin nodded. Come on in, Leonard. Mr. Donnelly was just leaving. Richard's eyes narrowed slightly. What's this about? Business, Calvin replied simply. My business. Inside, Leonard opened his case on the newly cleaned kitchen table, pulling out a portfolio of photographs. These are extraordinary, Leonard said, gesturing to images of Calvin's carvings. His enthusiasm echoed in the cabin's open space. The detail work, the sense of motion. You have a remarkable gift, Calvin, particularly this eagle. Even unfinished, it shows exceptional promise. Richard remained in the doorway, watching the interaction with poorly concealed interest. The regional art market has been hungry for authentic local work, Leonard continued, unfolding a document. Based on what I've seen, I'm prepared to offer you a contract for an initial collection. 6 to 8 pieces, displayed exclusively through my gallery. He named a figure that made even Richard blink. That's per piece, Leonard clarified, not for the collection. And I've already had inquiries about commissions once word got out about your work. Calvin nodded, thoughtfully, feeling Richard's stare. I've been considering converting the workshop out back into a proper studio, plenty of natural light, good ventilation. Perfect, Leonard exclaimed. Location is part of the appeal, authentic Montana craftsmanship created on historic property. We could host a showing right here once the weather improves. Richard cleared his throat. I should be going. We'll continue our conversation another time, Mr. Mercer. Calvin watched through the window as Richard stalked back to his SUV, phone already pressed to his ear as he drove away. Was that Richard Donnelly? Leonard asked, arranging contract papers on the table. Yes, Calvin replied. He's interested in the property. Bet he is, Leonard snorted. Half the county knows he needs this access point for his development. Without it, he'd have to reroute everything through wetland review areas. Add years to the approval process. Calvin turned back to the contract, a sense of satisfaction settling over him. Let's discuss these terms, Leonard. I think we have the beginnings of a profitable relationship. Richard's face had paled seeing the appraisal. Calvin wasn't just sitting on valuable land, but had unexpected resources they hadn't calculated. The rectory of First Methodist was quiet save for the ticking of an ancient grandfather clock and the occasional creak of Pastor Mitchell's rocking chair. Outside, a late March rain tapped against the windows, creating shadows that danced across the book-lined walls. The room smelled of pipe tobacco and old leather, comforting scents that reminded Calvin of his own father's study. I won't pretend to understand all the financial details, Pastor Mitchell said, pouring tea into a chipped mug and sliding it across the desk to Calvin. Steam rose between them, carrying the scent of bergamot. But I understand betrayal well enough. Calvin wrapped his fingers around the warm mug, the ceramics soothing against his calloused hands. I've set everything in motion. Property transfer, separate accounts, documentation of the fraud attempts. He paused, staring into the amber liquid. It all feels cold, calculated. As calculated as their actions against you? The pastor asked quietly. That's what I keep asking myself. Calvin's voice dropped. Am I any better than them if I strike back this way? Pastor Mitchell leaned back in his chair, the wood creaking beneath his weight. Rain intensified outside, drumming against the tin gutters. There's a difference between revenge and consequences, Calvin. Is there? Sometimes I'm not sure. Revenge seeks to inflict pain for pain's sake, the pastor said. It burns everything in its path, including the one seeking it. He sipped his tea thoughtfully. Consequences, on the other hand, simply allow natural outcomes to unfold. The rain falls on the just and unjust alike. Calvin nodded slowly. I could confront her, demand explanations, have it out in the open. And what would that accomplish besides public spectacle? Honesty, at least. Pastor Mitchell's eyes, kind but shrewd, studied Calvin's face. Would it change what's happened? Would it restore trust? No, Calvin admitted. Then perhaps the kindest action, for everyone, including Maggie, is to proceed as you've planned, without dramatics, without vengeance. The pastor set down his mug. Justice doesn't require cruelty to be effective. Sam says I should file criminal charges once everything's secure, Calvin said. Claims it's the only way to stop them from doing this to someone else. That may be true, Pastor Mitchell acknowledged, but that decision doesn't need to be made tonight. He leaned forward, resting his weathered hands on the desk. The question I think you're really asking, Calvin, is whether protecting yourself from harm is itself a form of harm. The clock ticked steadily in the corner. Rain continued its gentle percussion against the windows. In the distance, thunder rumbled, spring storms replacing winter's silent snow. I've spent my life building things, Calvin said finally. Our home, our savings, my reputation, even these. He held up his hands, the calluses of his woodworking visible in the lamplight. The thought of tearing it all down, even for justice's sake. Sometimes the kindest thing we can do is to let consequences teach what words cannot. The First National Bank conference room remained as Calvin remembered it from his management days: polished oak table, leather chairs, discreetly expensive artwork on walls the color of old money. The rain had stopped, but water still streaked the tall windows overlooking Main Street, refracting the afternoon light. The room smelled faintly of furniture polish, and the coffee service arranged at the sideboard. Calvin sat beside Sam Turner, their reflections ghostly in the table's glossy surface. Across from them, Eliza Kemp arranged documents with quiet efficiency, the rustle of papers the only sound until the door opened. Bank President Thomas Wilson entered with a perfunctory knock, followed by the bank's legal counsel, Arthur Green. Both men nodded to Calvin with the deference due a former colleague before taking their seats. "Thank you for meeting with us," Calvin began, his banker's voice returning naturally, calm, authoritative, precise. "Of course," Wilson replied. "Though I must say, your request was unusual." Sam slid a folder across the table. "These documents establish the pattern we discussed over the phone. Unauthorized attempts to access retirement accounts, forged signatures on equity withdrawal applications, fraudulent representation regarding mental competency." Arthur Green examined the papers, his expression professionally neutral. "These are serious allegations, Mr. Mercer." "They're documented facts," Calvin corrected gently. "Not allegations." Eliza cleared her throat. "I've verified the signature discrepancies personally, as has our fraud department." She produced another folder. "The retirement account access attempts came from Mr. Mercer's home IP address, but timestamps indicate he was elsewhere. Bank security footage confirms his presence here during several of the attempts." Wilson leaned forward. "What exactly are you requesting from the bank, Calvin?" "Three things," Calvin replied. "First, formal documentation of these findings for my records. Second, immediate security protocols on all joint accounts to require in-person verification for any significant transactions. Third, recognition of the transfer of my personal inheritance property into a protected trust, separate from marital assets." Green raised an eyebrow. "The third item isn't strictly a banking matter." "The trust documentation has already been filed with the county," Sam interjected. "We're simply requesting acknowledgement in the bank's records, given the attempts to misrepresent Calvin's competency." Wilson and Green exchanged glances. "There's also the matter of potential elder financial exploitation," Eliza added quietly, "which the bank has reporting obligations for under state law." Calvin raised his hand slightly. "I'm not asking the bank to file those reports at this time. That's my decision to make." Wilson nodded slowly. "And do you intend to make it?" "That depends," Calvin said, "on what happens next." Green sighed, closing the folder. "The documentation and account security measures are straightforward. We can implement those immediately. The trust acknowledgement will require review by our estate department, but shouldn't be problematic." "Thank you," Calvin said. He reached into his breast pocket and removed an envelope, placing it carefully on the table. "This contains written notification that I'm withdrawing from all joint accounts and credit facilities, effective today. I've established separate banking arrangements for my personal funds." Wilson's expression shifted to concern. Calvin, I hope you know you're always welcome at First National. If there's been some dissatisfaction with our services, this isn't about the bank, Thomas, Calvin interrupted gently. It's about keeping clear lines between what's mine and what's shared, given the circumstances. The room fell silent except for the ticking of the wall clock. Finally, Green gathered the documents and stood. We'll process everything according to your wishes, he said. The formal documentation should be ready by tomorrow. Calvin nodded his thanks. As the meeting concluded and hands were shaken, Eliza caught his eye. There's one more thing, she said, handing him a business card. Sheriff Willis asked me to give you this, said you might want to call him about some property development concerns in the county. Calvin accepted the card, understanding the implication. With the last signature dry, he nodded to Eliza. Time to send the invitation. April sunshine streamed through the recently cleaned windows of First National's largest conference room. The leather chairs that circled the massive oak table gleamed with fresh polish. A coffee service had been arranged at the sideboard, the rich aroma mingling with the scent of lemon furniture wax. Outside, Main Street bustled with activity, spring having finally taken firm hold after Montana's long winter. Calvin arrived 15 minutes early, dressed in a suit he hadn't worn since retirement. Sam Turner accompanied him, carrying a briefcase of documents organized with a lawyer's precision. Eliza greeted them at the door, her professional smile carrying a hint of anticipation. Conference room A is ready, she said, leading them down the hallway. Sheriff Willis arrived a few minutes ago. The bank president and legal counsel will join shortly. Calvin nodded his thanks, straightening his tie as they entered the room. Sheriff Willis stood by the window, his uniform pressed, badge catching the sunlight. He turned and extended his hand. Mr. Mercer, he said, his voice carrying the measured calm of law enforcement, appreciate you agreeing to this meeting. Thank you for your assistance, Sheriff, Calvin replied. They had spoken several times over the past week, each conversation adding weight to what would unfold today. The door opened again, admitting Thomas Wilson and Arthur Green, followed by Pastor Mitchell, whose presence had been Calvin's specific request. The men exchanged greetings, an undercurrent of tension beneath the professional courtesy. At precisely 10 o'clock, Eliza's desk phone buzzed. She answered, listened briefly, then looked up. Mrs. Mercer and Mr. Donnelly have arrived. Calvin took his seat at the head of the table, a position he'd occupied during countless meetings throughout his banking career. Sam arranged documents before him with methodical care. The sheriff stood near the window, slightly apart from the group, observing. Maggie entered first, confusion flickering across her face as she took in the assembled group. Richard followed, his confidence faltering only slightly when he spotted the sheriff. What's going on? Maggie asked, her voice steady but wary. The message just said there were urgent matters regarding our accounts. Please, have a seat, Calvin said, gesturing to the chairs across from him. The polished table surface reflected their face, distorted slightly by the wood grain. Richard remained standing. If this is about the development loans, we should have our full team present. This isn't about loans, Mr. Donnelly, Thomas Wilson said. Please, sit down. The room fell silent, save for the scrape of chairs against carpet. Outside, a car horn blared briefly, the sound muffled by thick windows. Calvin looked at his wife of 40 years, searching for any hint of the woman he'd fallen in love with. Her face revealed nothing except calculated concern. I'll be direct, Calvin began, his voice quiet but clear. For the past 3 months, there have been multiple unauthorized attempts to access our joint accounts, forge my signature, and misrepresent my mental competency. Maggie's expression shifted to practiced sympathy. Calvin, this is exactly what we've been concerned about. These confusions you've been having. Mrs. Mercer, Eliza interrupted, sliding a folder across the table. These are bank records showing access attempts to your husband's retirement accounts. The timestamps and IP addresses have been verified. They originate from your home computer during hours when Mr. Mercer was demonstrably elsewhere. Richard leaned forward. What exactly are you implying? Sheriff Willis stepped away from the window. They're not implying anything, Mr. Donnelly. They're stating facts. He placed a slim file beside Eliza's. This contains records from the county clerk's office documenting irregular inquiries about property holdings around Heron Lake, specifically targeting parcels owned by seniors living alone or those with reported cognitive issues. Calvin watched as Maggie's composure began to crack, a slight tremor in her manicured hand as she reached for her water glass. This is ridiculous, Richard declared. Donnelly Properties conducts thorough research on all potential development areas. There's nothing irregular about property inquiries. There is when they're followed by fraudulent financial activity targeting the property owners, Arthur Green noted, his legal training evident in his precise tone. Sam Turner opened his briefcase, removing a stack of documents bound with a blue cover. This report compiles evidence from 6 separate cases in neighboring Jefferson County, where elderly property owners reported similar patterns. Rumors of cognitive decline, followed by financial irregularities, followed by distressed property sales to shell companies later traced to Donnelly Properties. The room fell silent again. A clock ticked steadily on the wall. Calvin studied Richard's face, watching confidence transform into calculation. "Calvin," Maggie said, her voice softening to the tone she'd once used when they were first married. "There's clearly been a misunderstanding. If there were irregular account activities, it was only because I was trying to protect our interests while you've been struggling." "The forgeries were to protect me?" Calvin asked quietly. "You haven't been yourself," she insisted. "The hours in that workshop, the confusion about appointments, the mood changes. The doctor said—" "I've spoken with Dr. Andrews," Pastor Mitchell interjected gently. "No such concerns were ever raised during Mr. Mercer's appointments, nor did the doctor ever suggest cognitive evaluation." The room fell silent as this registered. Maggie's eyes darted to Richard, a momentary flash of panic before she regained composure. "What do you want, Calvin?" she asked finally, her voice hardening. Calvin leaned forward, hands clasped on the polished surface. "What I want is irrelevant now. What will happen is this. The bank has already secured all our joint accounts against unauthorized access. My personal inheritance property has been transferred to a protected trust. The forgery evidence has been documented." He paused. "The sheriff has everything needed to file charges, should I choose that path." Richard's face darkened. "This is harassment and defamation. My attorneys will—" "Your attorneys will be busy with the Jefferson County investigation," Sheriff Willis interrupted. "The warrant was served this morning." The coffee in the carafe had grown cold, untouched. Outside, clouds passed over the sun, momentarily dimming the room. The tick of the clock seemed to grow louder in the silence. "This meeting isn't about punishment," Calvin said finally. "It's about truth and choices." Maggie's composure cracked further, her carefully applied makeup unable to hide the flush of anger or fear. "What choices?" Calvin gathered his papers calmly. "You wanted me to disappear. As of today, I have, from our accounts, our house and your future." The bank's conference room had emptied save for Calvin, Sam, and Sheriff Willis. The tension that had filled the space lingered like a dissipating fog. Coffee cups sat abandoned, half empty. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the polished table. "Jefferson County's investigation has been ongoing for months," Sheriff Willis said, gathering his notes. "Your evidence was the missing piece. Similar pattern, same players, but you documented it better than the others." Calvin nodded, suddenly feeling every one of his 68 years. "What happens to them now?" "Legally?" The sheriff shrugged. "Depends how far the prosecutors want to take it. Forgery, fraud, conspiracy charges are all on the table. Mr. Donnelly's development empire won't survive this intact, that's certain." Sam closed his briefcase with a definitive click. "The civil consequences are already in motion. The bank's elder fraud protocols have been triggered. The trust protecting your property is ironclad. The divorce filing goes to the court tomorrow." Sheriff Willis hesitated, then added, "There's something else you should know, Calvin. We found evidence that Donnelly's been using this same approach in 3 counties, targeting retirement communities, widowers, anyone with lakefront property and limited family connections." The implication hung in the air. Calvin wasn't the first victim, merely the first to fight back effectively. The sheriff continued, "When we executed the search warrant at Donnelly's office this morning, we found planning maps. Every vulnerable property owner around Heron Lake had been identified. Your grandfather's land was marked as high priority, access essential." Calvin stared out the window at the town he'd served for 4 decades. Familiar faces passed on the sidewalk below, unaware of the drama that had just unfolded. "Will you proceed with criminal charges?" Sam asked quietly. Calvin considered the question that had haunted him for weeks. "Yes," he said finally. "Not for vengeance, but for protection. So it doesn't happen to anyone else." Sheriff Willis nodded, respecting the decision. "I'll need you to make a formal statement tomorrow. My office? 10 o'clock?" After the sheriff departed, Calvin and Sam lingered in the quiet room. The bank continued its business outside the conference room doors, the muffled sounds of commerce carrying on as it had for generations. 40 years at this bank, Calvin mused. I thought I'd seen every kind of financial scheme possible. Never thought you'd be the target, Sam supplied. No, never thought it would come from her. Calvin straightened his tie, a gesture from his banking days that had always centered him. I keep asking myself when it changed, when I became an obstacle rather than a husband. Sam had no answer. Some betrayals defied explanation. As they gathered their things to leave, Eliza appeared in the doorway. There's a message for you, Calvin, Leonard Harris called. He's finalized arrangements for the cabin gallery opening next month. Calvin nodded his thanks, a sense of completion settling over him. Richard's legal troubles would prevent any development around Heron Lake for years. The cabin renovation was nearly finished. The eagle carving waited in his workshop, nearly complete after months of patient work. One more thing, Eliza added, handing him an envelope. The statement from your new accounts. Everything transferred successfully. Calvin accepted the envelope, the bank's logo crisp against the white paper. Inside was confirmation of his financial independence, built from the remnants of what Maggie hadn't managed to touch. The papers revealed what Calvin had suspected for weeks. He had lost much, but saved enough. Not just money, but dignity, purpose, future. The lawyer's office smelled of leather portfolios and expensive aftershave. May sunshine streamed through vertical blinds, creating alternating bars of light across the polished conference table. Outside, a lawn sprinkler ticked rhythmically, the sound of water hitting new spring grass carrying through the partially open window. Calvin sat across from Maggie for the first time since the bank meeting 3 weeks earlier. Their attorneys flanked them, Sam beside Calvin, a slick corporate type beside Maggie. Papers covered the table between them, the accumulated documentation of 40 years of marriage reduced to assets and liabilities. Maggie looked smaller somehow, her designer outfit still perfect, but her confidence diminished. The Jefferson County investigation had made headlines across the state. Richard Donnelly was out on bail, his development company in free fall, investors fleeing. 3 other victims had come forward with similar stories of manipulation and fraud. The terms are straightforward, Sam explained, his tone professionally neutral. The family home goes to Mrs. Mercer, along with its remaining equity. Mr. Mercer retains his grandfather's property and workshop. Retirement accounts are divided 60-40, with the larger portion to Mrs. Mercer. Calvin had insisted on this split, despite Sam's objections. She'll need it more than I will, he had explained simply. Personal property has been inventoried and divided as specified in Addendum C, Sam continued. No ongoing spousal support requested by either party. Maggie's attorney leaned forward. My client accepts these terms but requests modification to the publicity clause. Given recent events, a mutual non-disclosure agreement would benefit both parties. Sam glanced at Calvin, who nodded once. Agreed, Sam replied. No public statements about the marriage or its dissolution beyond the fact of divorce itself. Pens scratched against paper as initials were added to amended clauses. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, marking the final minutes of a 4-decade union. Outside, birds chirped as they built nests in the ornamental trees lining the parking lot. When the last page awaited signatures, Calvin finally spoke. Is there anything you want to say, Maggie? Anything at all? Her eyes, once so familiar, met his briefly before sliding away. What would be the point now? He nodded, accepting the answer as confirmation of all he needed to know. The fountain pen felt heavy in his hand, the same pen he'd used to sign their mortgage, their investment accounts, their life insurance policies. The ink flowed smoothly as he signed his name for the final time as her husband. Maggie signed after him, her signature as elegant as always. The lawyers added their witness signatures, and it was done. As they rose to leave, Maggie paused. The house feels empty without your things. You'll fill it again, Calvin replied, not unkindly. And you? That old cabin is hardly enough space. It's all I need. They walked to the parking lot separately. No embrace, no tears, no final words of recrimination or regret, just the quiet end of something that had already died long before papers made it official. Calvin slid behind the wheel of his truck, the leather seat warm from the spring sun. Through the windshield, he watched Maggie enter a taxi, her back straight, her movements precise. The same hands she had mocked now signed the papers granting her freedom, but nothing more. The Heron Lake cabin gleamed in the May sunshine, its logs freshly stained, its windows sparkling. The porch had been rebuilt, wider now, with a railing of polished pine and comfortable Adirondack chairs facing the water. A gravel path lined with river stones led from the parking area to the front steps, bordered by newly planted native grasses. Cars lined the approach road, parked wherever space allowed. Voices and laughter carried across the property as Oak Ridge residents explored the transformed space. Inside, Leonard Harris directed the placement of the final display stands, each positioned to showcase Calvin's carvings in the best natural light. Calvin stood in what had once been his grandfather's workshop, now converted into a bright, airy studio. The walls had been removed and replaced with windows, allowing an unobstructed view of the lake from his workbench. The space smelled of fresh-cut lumber, linseed oil, and possibility. The eagle carving sat on a pedestal in the center of the room, finally complete after months of patient work. Its wings extended in flight, each feather distinct, its eyes capturing a fierce dignity that seemed to transcend the wood itself. "Remarkable work," Pastor Mitchell said, appearing in the doorway. "Your grandfather would be proud." "Thank you for coming," Calvin replied, gesturing the older man inside. "Wasn't sure anyone would make the drive out here." The pastor chuckled. "Half the town's already arrived, and more on the way. Leonard says he sold 3 pieces before the official opening even starts." Through the open door, Calvin could see neighbors and former colleagues examining his work, their expressions ranging from surprise to admiration. Eliza from the bank was there with her husband. Sheriff Willis chatted with Sam near the refreshment table. Even Mrs. Hoffman from the county clerk's office had made the journey. "Word travels fast in small towns," Pastor Mitchell observed, "especially when it's a good word." Calvin nodded, adjusting the eagle's position slightly. "Never expected this to become anything more than a hobby." "Life rarely follows our expectations," the pastor replied. "Sometimes the detours lead us exactly where we need to be." Leonard Harris appeared, clipboard in hand, barely containing his excitement. "We should begin the formal opening, Calvin. I've already got committed buyers for 5 pieces and serious interest in 3 more." He gestured to the eagle. "And I've had 2 offers for this one, though I told them it wasn't for sale." "It's not," Calvin confirmed. The eagle represented too much: loss, perseverance, rebirth, to be sold. They moved to the porch, where Leonard had arranged a small podium. The crowd gathered on the newly laid lawn, wineglasses and punch cups in hand. The lake sparkled behind them, its surface rippling gently in the spring breeze. Leonard introduced Calvin briefly, describing his journey from hobbyist to artist with professional enthusiasm. The crowd applauded politely, their faces upturned, curious. Calvin stepped forward, unaccustomed to public speaking since retirement. The words he'd prepared seemed suddenly inadequate. "This land has been in my family for 3 generations," he began, his voice carrying across the attentive crowd. "My grandfather built this cabin with these hands." He held them up briefly, the calluses visible. "He taught me that creating something lasting takes patience, vision, and faith in your own abilities." A murmur of appreciation rippled through the gathering. "I forgot that lesson for many years," Calvin continued. "Got caught up in other measures of success. It took recent events to remind me what truly matters." And his eyes moved across the faces before him, people who had known him his entire life, who had witnessed his rise at the bank, his retirement, and the painful dissolution of his marriage. There was no judgment in their expressions, only community. "This gallery represents a new chapter," he concluded simply. "Not just for me, but for this historic property. I'm grateful you're here to share it." The applause was warm and genuine. As people moved inside to view the collection, Sam approached, raising his glass in a private toast. "To new beginnings," his old friend said. Calvin nodded, the weight of the past months finally lifting. Inside, Leonard was already writing up sales. Through the studio windows, Calvin could see visitors admiring the eagle carving, its wings catching the afternoon light. The eagle's wings, finally complete, caught the spring light through newly installed windows. The May sunrise warmed the old porch boards where Calvin sat, coffee steam rising in the morning air. His rocking chair creaked rhythmically, a counterpoint to the birdsong that filled the trees around the cabin. Across the lake, early fishermen cast lines that broke the glassy surface, their distant voices carrying like memories across the water. The cabin, his grandfather's legacy reborn, stood solid against the backdrop of pine and new spring growth. Inside, most of the carvings from yesterday's gallery opening had been marked with small sold cards, exceeding even Leonard's optimistic projections. Only the eagle remained untagged, positioned where morning light caught its outstretched wings. Calvin ran a thumb over calloused fingers, feeling each groove earned through decades of work. First with numbers at the bank, now with wood and tools. Both required patience, precision, and the wisdom to see patterns others missed. Maggie had left town 3 days ago, according to Sam, who heard it from the realtor handling the sale of their former home. The house had sold quickly, above asking price. Richard Donnelly remained embroiled in legal troubles, his development plans indefinitely postponed. The land around Heron Lake would remain unchanged for now, its shoreline protected from concrete and construction. Some folks spend their whole lives running from who they are, Sam had told him yesterday, lines crinkling around his eyes as they'd shared a celebratory whiskey after the gallery closing. You just found your way back. A robin landed on the porch rail, tilting its head curiously at the old man with the coffee cup. Calvin smiled. At 68, he discovered that disappearing wasn't about becoming invisible. It was about becoming exactly who you were meant to be, away from those who couldn't see your value. The morning sun caught the workshop windows, glinting like promise. In his pocket, the check from Leonard represented not just financial security, but validation of a skill he'd only recently embraced fully. The orders for new pieces would keep him busy through summer and into fall. Today he would start a new carving. Something for the front entrance. Something that said, "Welcome to those who come with honest hearts." The robin chirped once more before taking flight, wings spread against the brightening sky. Calvin watched it go, then turned back to his coffee, content in the silence. The winter was over in more ways than one. Spring had returned to Heron Lake, and to him.